He said, look at her, she was trying to take me.
Yeah.
What do you think is about funny boy, huh? That's what my kids were. Because I was here. Yes, you guys are just funny. You are. Are you funny? Are you funny, little cheeks? Are you funny? You are. Hi, how are you doing? Good, how are you doing? Good. I was gonna rescue him and he starts calling because Mama showed up.
I made a mistake of coming up with that.
There's something special about mom, isn't there?
I know. Mine all did the same.
He's still smiling at you. He always smiles.
Yep. Are you still smiling? You are. Yep.
Morning.
Morning.
How are you? How are you doing? As good as I can get away with it. How about that?
All right.
It was
Yeah.
so much fun.
Are y'all ready
We all
for
enjoyed it.
fall?
Busy trip, but we had a lot of fun. We're kind of glad to be back.
Hard to roll into that mode, isn't
It
it?
was still like 90 degrees.
Yeah, I just checked. I
It was super hot. I mean, I grew up down there, but it was not fresh in my memory, but
It
it
should
was still
start
that hot in
on
September.
Christmas Eve.
So it was.
Okay.
And everybody.
We all had
New
such a
Year's.
great time. How are you
Maybe
guys?
all right.
Just short
I
You know, it's just harder for a couple of nice days
Yeah,
like it's the
Right,
right
that's
now
the airport.
to just
We
go,
didn't know.
oh yeah, I'm really ready.
Oh, we didn't know they
Not
had
be
flown,
like
and
that.
we got the
Yeah.
kids and I got on the plane and he was sitting in the
Yep,
airport.
that's it.
Well, I guess we better get ready, because we know what happens. It comes anyway.
I know.
Well, I'm glad you're out and about.
Oh, I'm always talking about it. Even if my car got stuck in the snow, right? I can always find it.
There you go.
Okay.
Sometimes that's what it takes.
Yeah,
Well, we're glad there's no new snow this morning.
I
It
know.
was your turn.
We're not ready for that. We're not ready for that.
I wrote a text to somebody this morning and I said, well, it sounded like it was raining.
We had to,
I didn't hear something of that. I don't know what it was, but anyway.
but,
You have any trees nearby? Eight little reindeer?
Oh, that was nice.
Well, did you ever figure it out, or is it just?
we did make it more places just to tag it all the way.
I don't know. But anyway, somebody texted me back. and he said, "No way." And you don't have to shovel it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We had an issue.
so true.
Yep.
Shed. I'm sorry.
Mary.
Good. That's stuff. I think we should stay hydrated. We got to Seattle. and, like, Yeah, I had to go to the doctor.
Yeah, so they took us well, remember she had the first one.
Yeah.
And then she had the second one, she, when she had the second one, she was.
Expectation.
Yeah.
Are you coming back?
I don't know about the Blaines, when they come back this afternoon or tomorrow, but I do know that the first come back.
Alan actually, someone from the county. Is the rest of the world coming?
She did what she told Grandma, and so, yeah, so we, and then, coming back.
Do this special for the porch. camera and ring the doorbell. If I'm upstairs sewing, I never hear anything. And so I said, here, for $10, I'll give it a try. Can't beat it much. It's working better than I thought. An extra little ring upstairs. You get a little, if my hearing aids, you get a Bluetooth. But if you were there, it's connected, and you can see a picture on the phone all the time.
Yeah.
But I did see a moose coming in the driveway on a picture at night time. It did take a picture that, I mean, it's not clear, but definitely, and I saw the tracks. So I said, well, it's a big moose here. I'm gonna go see if they can pick that up. Yeah. But it's really too sensitive for me because I think if a bird flies by it. Yeah, because I've got it, I just ignore it anymore. They aren't that obnoxious, just vain. So I just kind of ignore it, trying to figure it out. Hopefully I can shut it down. Luckily, it doesn't ring in the house. It only rings if someone pushes there. Oh, I see. Okay. And so you got to push the button. But
So we gotta make the rest of our trip.
I don't know what's for it.
Yeah,
$10,
yeah.
I'll try
I
it.
should put it in our,
Gone on Amazon. I think they're normally only like $15 or something.
Saturday.
It's called
Yeah.
Inlet.
Yeah, it's tiring, yeah, for her, you know, when she's tired, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there is the
But
ring
it's still fun, you
system.
guys got to know.
Yeah,
the
it was
ring.
fun.
Have that
To go to
experience.
the ring.
You did go to a great, yeah.
Yes, and that does a really good job.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's like
all the time we were
$50
not
or
a great
something.
kid, and with
And
the
I
day
said,
we went to yours,
not
it was
going back.
62 degrees.
Oh, well, it's windy.
I got it this morning.
Started forward.
Oh, no.
And Kate and Nicole had their jackets on, and then I went up to her car. And so.
This one is AIWIT, so there's a notification.
Yeah.
And so this is what I get.
Yeah.
And put them on, walk outside, put rain.
I have to figure out how it keeps going around and around. It wants you to buy, you know, that's one thing. It wants you to buy
And I
clouds.
did one.
And I went, no, I don't know. But so if it appears you do see, like when you were there, you saw your car, Loretta's truck was parked there. So because that's the door jamb, I have it on the door, so.
Oh, yeah.
It's the door jamb.
Oh,
here. And this is supposed to have human identification, so it thinks it's close sometimes.
So.
I see it outlined in orange. I'm like, oh, okay.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's a good tree, I know, those are so fun.
Yes.
So how's your knee? Your knee? Yeah, we wondered, we said, well, I wonder if Mary ended up doing too much or. Yes, I did. Good. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Nicole, oh, you're, oh,
Thank
you.
Yeah, Nicole and Kate.
Thank you.
Oh, man, that is hilarious. I can tell you just can't pictures like that. That is
They
so
put
funny.
on show, the whole thing on their backs.
That is hilarious.
Well, Barnabas, how do things go?
Went pretty well.
Good. I thought she'd be done painting by now.
Yeah, it was rainy, she was only there, she was there most days.
Oh, yeah. I tried to do it.
Yeah. So, they're just saying.
I was just gonna say,
I was gonna bring it this morning, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to be here. Thank you, sweetheart.
Thank you.
Well,
Yep, that was the one thing
I didn't like that.
I don't know if that's it.
Anything in the fridge?
I always forget something.
Right, right. Doesn't that, and then I've had, it's a sheet, or was the internet now somewhere? Yes, it is. Especially if you're in line somewhere, like you get lines. Because we just automatically assume that you got a fraudulent one for whatever.
Hi, sweetie.
I did one time, it was because the expiration date came up. And I didn't pay attention to that. And but same thing at the beginning, you don't know that.
All right, let's go ahead and get started on our Bible class. We're going through Zephaniah. You know, traditionally we go through them chapter by chapter, but since I realized I was going to be teaching 3 weeks in a row, I haven't stuck real close to the chapter lines, but I am going to do 3 chapters in 3 weeks. So we made it to verse 6 of the first chapter of Zephaniah last week. This week I plan to cover all the rest of Zephaniah chapter 1 and all of Zephaniah chapter 2 and possibly even some of Zephaniah 3, although Zephaniah 3 is mostly what I have planned for next week. I'm going to recap just a little bit, but before we get started, are there any announcements, any prayer requests, anything that we need to go over?
My friend up in Anchorage, her niece that I asked to be prayed for before,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, she's not doing well. They said, but they found some other medication that's kind of helping a little bit, but they're still not sure how long it's going to give her. And she was frantic to get rid of everything that was hers, so her husband and family wouldn't have to do it. And so they said if she lives 2 more years, she's going to be having to find some things. So, but anyway,
Okay.
her name is Terry Lane.
Mm-hmm.
My sister-in-law Sue has breast cancer and she's got a pacemaker and they can't move it and it's right, the cancer is right by the pacemaker. So they're trying to figure out what to do. So appreciate prayers that they figure something out.
Okay. Lots of people still traveling home after the wedding in Wasilla yesterday. A few of us crazy people went up and back in one day, but a lot more people will be coming back this afternoon and maybe even tomorrow and things like that. So. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather, to study your word, to learn more about you. We ask that you would be with those that were mentioned. Be with Sue and her breast cancer, be with Terry Lane and the difficulties she's facing, and help the changes in her medicine to be effective. Be with those that we know that are traveling. Be with Becca and Keelan as they start their new marriage just yesterday. Be with us as we prepare to worship you here with a small group. Thank you for the blessings you've given us. These prayers and thanks we give in Jesus' name. All right, a little bit of a recap on Zephaniah. Won't spend too much time on this because this is what we looked at last week. But we have Zephaniah. He's of the royal line. He introduces himself as Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah. So King Josiah, who would be king at the time when Zephaniah wrote this, is actually a relative of Zephaniah. They are both descendants from Hezekiah. There is one generation additional in between them. So at least generationally, Josiah is, Zephaniah is younger than Josiah, and Josiah is quite a young man. I don't know that their ages are as different as their generations, because in particular, one of the kings in between them lived longer than average for those times. So it's very, very possible that they are very similar ages, but more than likely they're neither one of them old men at this time. And we discussed some of the circumstances because there is some debate just because they are a generation different as to whether this is factually accurate or not. And of course, those of us that believe the Bible, obviously believe what it says and that he was the son of Hezekiah, but it's also just not that hard to believe in worldly terms. We see cases where somebody's uncle is the same age or even younger than somebody of another generation even today. And so we went over some of the arguments that scholars have on that. We also went over the different categories of people that this letter addresses in the first few verses. And some of the circumstances at the time with Josiah being quite famous as the king that really turned back towards the Lord, really made reforms in Israel. But there's addresses towards the remnant of the idol worship. And in verse 4, it addresses that he's going to cut off that remnant, and he addresses the cherubims or the evil idolatrous priest, those that were priests of that idolatrous practice. And he also addressed the priest because in Judea, these idolatrous practices have been mixed with worship of the true God. And so you had statues to these different gods that were set up within the temple. And so he specifically addressed those evil priests and the priest, and looking at how that would reference the Levitical priesthood that was allowing this to happen, and the idolatrous priest. And then he also, in verse 6, addressed those that were turned back from the Lord and those that had not sought the Lord or inquired of him. So you really had these categories of people, and that's what we looked at last week. You had idolatrous people, that had these pagan practices. You had the Levitical priesthood that believed in God but allowed these other practices to come in. Maybe they were polytheist, maybe they just were passive about the matter. I don't know which. Probably some of both. And then you've got these people that just are simply not religious. They never had inquired of the Lord, and they never sought the Lord, or they had turned back to the Lord. So categories of people that we could probably all relate to today. Those that are culturally influenced and allow other things to mix in with worship of God. Those that are that don't believe in God and believe in other things, and those that have no interest to seek the Lord whatsoever. And of course, this is all happening during a time of reform, and we've seen numerous generations of kings that have, you go all the way back to Hezekiah, which Zephaniah is unusual in that he traces his lineage back more generations than most in order to connect to Hezekiah, who was a heavy reformer and followed after God. And now this is all happening in the days of Josiah, who was also a reformer, but in between there's been just evil kings. Or at least some of those kings actually did repent right before their death. It's recorded in some of those stories about them, but close enough to their deathbed that they never resolve the evil that they brought upon society. So I always find that story a little bit fascinating. So today we're going to get into, what we see who he's addressed this to. We're going to cover a lot fairly quickly because, and I'm just going to kind of go through it verse by verse because it's really easy to understand. I feel like it doesn't need a lot of explanation, this evil and this punishment that's coming on, and also in many cases it's somewhat poetic, and it doesn't matter the exact thing of, oh, they're going to build, this is going to be a wasteland and this is going to be that bad and all that. In the case of a lot of these verses we're going to be going through, the important thing to understand is, the day of the Lord is coming. Judgment is coming upon them. I felt it was far more important to spend some time and get an idea of the circumstances this was written under and who it was written to. So today we're going to cover a lot of text pretty quickly. Starting in verse 7, it says, "Hold thy peace at the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. For the Lord hath prepared sacrifice, and he hath bid his guest. And it shall come to pass in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children, and all such as are clothed with strange apparel. In the same day also I will punish all those that leapt on the threshold, which fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that there shall be a noise of a cry from the fish gate, and a howling from the second, and a great crashing from the hills. Howl ye inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the merchant people are cut down, all they that bear silver are cut off. And it shall come to pass at that time, that I will search Jerusalem with candles, and punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. Therefore the good shall become a booty, and the houses a desolation. And they shall also build houses, but not inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards, but not drink the wine thereof. The great day of the Lord is near, it is near, and hasteth greatly. Even the voice of the day of the Lord, the mighty man shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and of distress, a day of wastedness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers. And I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as the dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy. For he shall make even a speedy riddance of all them that dwell in the land." So, excuse me, in these verses we see that the day of the Lord is at hand. And some of the verses we went and looked at last week pertaining to Josiah had referenced that God was not going to turn back his wrath because of all the evil that Judah had done, but he promised not to do it in the days of Josiah. So they're being told it's at hand, we know it's coming. And one of the things we discussed also last week is the timing of this. As I said, there's a lot of people that really debate when it was written, but really it's pretty possible to narrow it down to what was said in chapter 1, verse 1, that was written in the days of Josiah, but a lot of people debate, was it early in Josiah's reign? Was it late in Josiah's reign? And we're going to see some of those things. The first one, some felt that it was early in his reign because there was still that remnant of Baal that he talked about, that we studied last week, that needed cut off. But we're going to get into some things here shortly that, somewhat make other scholars think it was later. But I'm just going to kind of go through and look at some of the things that may come up here. As said, in verse 7, we're told the day of the Lord is at hand. That matches exactly what was written in historical books. The judgment on Judah was at hand. And I think the original audience, that was written this way, but like most prophetic books, sometimes there's more than one meaning. I think every one of us can always look and say that the day of the Lord is at hand. Judgment is coming. And that's something that's, driven over and over. There was judgment coming when Israel was going to be carried away to Babylonian. The day of the Lord, that term is used to describe, the coming of Christ. It's used to describe the apocalypse. The day of the Lord is coming, whatever that is. It's like, we need to understand that. And, it says also, hold your peace at the presence of the Lord, for the day of the Lord is at hand. In verse 8 it says, and it shall come to pass in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that it will punish the princes and the king's children and all such that are clothed with strange apparel. King James says strange apparel there. If you're reading the ESV, it says foreign apparel. That is actually much more accurate. I spent some time looking at that word. The word that's translated strange here really does just mean foreign. It doesn't mean strange as in evil or idolatrous. It means, the word literally means foreign. Now, whether it had any other meaning, I saw lots of commentaries where people discussed, was this reference to the Mosaic law, which said a man should not wear a woman's clothing and a woman should wear a man's clothing? Doesn't really seem to be the words that would pertain to that. Foreign, it could mean different. Some said that references the princes wearing idolatrous clothing. I think you'd have to read maybe more into that than what is here, but all such as are clothed with foreign clothing is very accurate as to what the original language meant. In verse 9 it says, in the same day also I will punish all those that leapt on the threshold and will fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. There's been a couple different lines of thoughts on this verse, but most people just believe it is, that action of leaping on the threshold and which matches with the violence and deceit, those that are violent people. Some people have thought that the leaping of the threshold referenced actions in certain idolatrous pagan worship where they would leap over the threshold, part of their show. Again, it's something I can't really find anything in the language that specifically identifies anything other than what's said here, leaping over the door and filling the houses with violence and deceit. Verse 10 says, it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that there should be a noise of a cry from the fish gate, and a howling from the second, and a great crashing from the hills. The fish gate was well known as one of the gates, and also the second gate. I want to say there were 4 gates total, but I can't remember for sure. But these are gates that are referenced, and it very much matches with what's coming in the verses following this. The fish gate was where they would bring fish in from fishing, and a lot of commerce. That was the commercial region of Jerusalem, if you will. And following saying there'll be a howling from the fish gate, he references these merchants, and then he goes on to those that handle silver. That's all they that bear silver is somewhat referencing bankers in particular. So we have reference to merchants and we have reference to bankers. The financial center of the city is going to see this ruin. In verse 11 it says, how ye inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the merchant people are cut down, all they that bear silver are cut off. And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with candles, and punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. I looked at candles and tried to figure that out. I mean, obviously it's with candles. So literally they're going to search the city with lights. I couldn't find anything that meant anything other than candles. It would be like, we're going to take a flashlight and we're going to go search the city. And then it goes on to say, and punish. So when it says searching, it's not like searching for a remnant to save them. No, these are the people coming through, desolating the city. They're gonna come through with a flashlight, with a candle, looking for these people. So it's not like you're gonna be able to just crouch down and hide in a dark corner. They're gonna be searching for you. And then it also says, and punish the men that are settled on their lees and say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. I can't remember exactly how the ESV translate this, but most newer translations translate this quite a bit differently. Barnabas, do you have the ESV?
Yes.
For verse 12?
At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill.
Okay, that are complacent. And that's the same, the New King James says, the men that are complacent. And the New American Standard, most any of your modern ones, but they usually include a footnote, if it's a version with footnotes. This word that says men that are settled on their lees, and you go to older translations like the King James, the original American Standard, they kept that wording. That lees also could be translated as dregs, referencing wine production, where you get sediment. It's all just there. These are the men that are just they're setting on the dregs, on the grinds at the bottom of their cup and the bottom of their barrel. So the thought matches, how the newer translations are translating those that are complacent, but that isn't really what the original language said. So the older translations are using more word for word in that these are the men that are setting on the dregs. But that doesn't really match what's followed. So the idea of them comfortably just sitting down here in the muck and the fines and the grinds, they're at the bottom, they're complacent, they're just sitting down there, saying that the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. This is the same category of people, it seems like, that we found in verse 6. It tends to go with those that are turned back from the Lord and have not sought the Lord or inquired of him. These are the people who are like, whether they believe in God or not, they're like, God isn't going to do good, nor is he going to do evil. They're complacent. They're settled down in their findings and their dust and their grindings, and just, those are the ones that are going to be sought out with lamps and candles or flashlights. The picture I have is flashlights, because I envision like an army coming in and SWAT teams like knocking down the doors and flashing the lights around the room. And it may have looked significantly different in the day with lamps and candles, but it's that same concept of how you go into a city and you're going to search people out. And those that are settled in their ways are gonna bear the brunt of that. Therefore their goods shall become a booty, and their houses a desolation. They shall also build houses, but not inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards, but not drink the wine thereof. The great day of the Lord is near. It is near, and hasteth greatly. Even the voice of the day of the Lord, the mighty man shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wastedness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. A day of the trumpets and the alarm against the fenced city and against the high towers. And I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord. And their blood shall be poured out as the dust, and their flesh as the dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. But the whole land shall be devoured by fire and his jealousy. And he shall make a speedy riddance of all them that dwell in the land. So that's kind of the what is coming on Jerusalem and all of Judea, really, particularly Jerusalem, but also this region surrounding that, because of their complacency, because of the evil that's happened. Does anybody have any input on chapter 1 before we try and dig into chapter 2? All right, I'm gonna get right into chapter 2. Now, the first few verses of chapter 2 are one of the verses that scholars use to try and date this. The first 3 verses of chapter 2 go like this. Gather yourselves together, ye. Gather together, O nation not desired. Before the decree bring forth, before the day passeth the chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you. Seek ye the Lord, all ye meek of the earth, which have wrought his judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. Now, a lot of people use this verse, and I wouldn't say they're wrong. As I said, I have some questions about exactly where to date this in Josiah's reign. And there's arguments one way or the other. I can't date it any more accurately. But there are scholars that think this references Josiah's Passover that he had, I believe, in his 14th year of his reign. He discovered the books of the law. He realized in discovering these manuscripts as he tries to restore the temple just how far they had violated God's covenant. And that same covenant, the passage that they uncovered while they were renovating the temple, said all these evil things that were going to happen to them. And Josiah read it, and he realized, it's like, wait, we've done all these things. We have this evil coming on us. And that's when he sends and inquires of the Lord through prophets, and is told, yes, these evil things are coming on you, but they're not coming in your days because you've repented. And then he has this huge Passover feast, and tries even harder to follow the law. Without taking the time to go back, I think many of us are familiar with the story, but that's just kind of the story in a nutshell, is my condensed version of it. So some scholars believe that Zephaniah wrote this right before or right around the time that they were preparing to have that great Passover feast. And that this is a call to that feast because it matches, kind of the circumstance of what was going on at that time. The humble come to Jerusalem, come keep the feast, keep the wars, keep the law. And there's wrath coming, but seek the Lord, that you may be hid in the days of the Lord's anger. Again, I don't know if that means these verses were written exactly then. I don't think it's necessarily has to be that way. I think the concept is the same. And that's what we see in the Bible, is God's concepts being repeated over and over. And this concept, whether it happened to be written at exactly that time, was the same concept of what was actually happening in society at that time. Gather yourselves together, you of the nation not desired. So Israel, they've just had bad things proclaimed against them. So that's the not desired. Before the decree bring forth, before the day passes the chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the days of the Lord's anger comes upon you, seek ye the Lord, ye meek of the earth. That's who God always calls, and that was the same case of who they called to come to that Passover that Josiah kept, was the meek and the humble and the lowly that were willing to return to God, that they may be hid in the days of the Lord's anger. So again, I don't know if that is quite true. That means that this was written at that time, because even if it's not, this is the same message that we find God sending out all the time. So they're a really unique 3 verses that really remind us of God's character, of what God was constantly calling Israel to do. We have all of Kings and Chronicles filled with Israel doing that, falling away, then the humble coming back to God, and his wrath being turned away for a while. So since that happened over and over, it's really hard to say if that's an actual dating thing, but it is kind of some of the things in Zephaniah that just make Zephaniah a very compact example of what really even the larger prophetic books had said. Zephaniah says a lot of things in very few words. Then we kind of change paragraphs, and I'm going to try and get through the rest of chapter 2 here, because the rest of chapter 2, the focus is shifted. It's really the same thing that he's been saying, that the day of the Lord is coming. But the rest of this chapter, he switches it from the day of the Lord is coming on you, Judah and Jerusalem, and he starts addressing the nations around them. And it's interesting, he picks 4 nations. He names a few different cities and groups of those nations. And some say, oh, he was just calling out those particular 4 nations. But, and I kind of agree with scholars that say, if you look at a map, he's calling out nations that are east, west, north, and south. And so many scholars believe that that's intentional. He's not just limiting it to these nations, but the point being is the nations around Israel at all 4 points of the compass, they also face this same judgment that the day of the Lord is coming. And that's really the rest of chapter 2. We'll read through it and look at some of those points, and that's probably about all the time I'm going to have this morning. So chapter 2, verse 4. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, the land of the Philistines. I will destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitant. The sea coast shall be dwellings and cottages for shepherds and folds of flocks. The coast shall be for a remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed thereon. In the houses of Ashkelon they shall lie down in the evening, for the Lord their God shall visit them and turn away their captivity. I have heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon, whereby they have reproached my people and magnified themselves against the border. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah, even the breeding of nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The residue of my people shall spoil them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. This shall they have for their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the heathen. Ye Ethiopians also, ye shall be slain by my sword, and he will stretch out his hand against the north, and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation, and dry like a wilderness. And flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. All the beasts of the nation, both the cormorant and the bittern, shall lodge in the upper lintels of it. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be in the thresholds, for he shall uncover the cedar walks. This is the rejoicing city that dwelt carelessly, and said in her heart, I am, and there is none beside me. How is she become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down in? Everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his head. So we see this proclamation against these nations. It starts out by addressing the Philistines towards the coast. He names, multiple of their cities and regions. But there's a message of hope in this also for Judah. For example, in verse 7 it says, And the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah, and they shall feed thereupon. And the houses of Ashkelon they shall lie down in the evening. For the Lord their God shall visit them, and turn away their captivity. So we already see in this reference to captivity, that Judah is going to be carried away in captivity. But afterwards, they're going to inherit those coastlands that were part of Canaan. Then he goes on to address Moab and Ammon, which were in the opposite direction. And they were actually descendants of Lot's and had continuously fought and squabbled with Israel, going all the way back to the days of Moses. And they're told that, you know, their day is coming, their downfall is coming, and they've been a thorn in the side, and they're going to become as Sodom and as Gomorrah. In verse 9 it says, the breeding of nettles and salt pits. So pretty much just wasteland is what they're going to have. And it's because of their pride that they had, we learn in verse 10. And in verse 11 it says, the Lord will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth. I can't remember, I haven't looked at this in a while, but if I remember right, just studying history, like you could find ruins of Moabites and Ammon. You know, there's still archaeological ruins. But as far as a country and as a culture, they just disappeared. They no longer exist. And there was a point where they just disappeared. So this is very true, that they will become like Sodom and Gomorrah. Their days were just numbered. Verse 12, there's very little said about those to the south. It says, ye Ethiopians also, ye shall be slain by my sword. Of course, King James translates it Ethiopians, which would be more, we would refer to the country as today, Ethiopia, you know, down in Africa, so south of them. Some translations will use Cushites, which is just another word for the same place. One thing worth noting is that in Zephaniah's lineage, back in chapter 1, verse 1, it says that Zephaniah is the son of Cushi. And some people believe that reference Cushi. The guy was called Cushi because he was a Cushite. So he was from Africa, the Ethiopian region. So there are some that, some modern scholars that believe that Zephaniah was actually an African of descent, and that all these ancient paintings that show him dressed in medieval costumes, which are highly inaccurate, are inaccurate also because they paint him not as a black man. I suppose that's possible. I really don't know. It is possible with him being named Cushi, but that just reminded me of that. Because Ethiopians are Cushites, it's the same region in Africa. And that's all it's really said. It's just one verse that mentions those in the south, which is why I think perhaps it was included just to include the 4 points of the compass, because he didn't really say a whole lot of them. They would be slain by the sword as well. Then in verse 13, he turns towards the north and towards Nineveh. And this passage is another group of verses that scholars use to try and date the time frame of this book, because Nineveh fell, I don't remember when, in BC. I want to say like 602, but I can't remember for sure. But it's either during the last 2 years of Josiah's reign, or possibly like within 2 years after Josiah's reign. So right near the end of his reign. And based on this, that he's predicting the fall of Nineveh. That was not necessarily when Assyria fell, but when the city of Nineveh, which was the capital city. So most scholars believe that had not happened yet, which is why most of them are like, well, this didn't happen in the last 2 years of Josiah's reign. So that's another thing that it doesn't really help us date this book extremely accurately, but it does appear that it was probably written before Nineveh actually fell. And James spent quite a bit talking about the book that, I can't remember which one it was, but predicted Nineveh's fall. And of course, we're all quite familiar with the story of Jonah. He went to Nineveh, they repented, but some generations later, a couple hundred years later, that city was utterly destroyed. And this is what this verse would be referencing. Verses 13 through the end of chapter 2, it says, and he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a a desolation, and dry like a wilderness. And flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. All the beasts of the nations, both the cormorant and the bittern, shall lodge in the upper linters of it. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be in the threshold, for he shall uncover the cedar walk. If you're looking at different translations, you're going to find all kinds of different animals used in different ones, rather than cormorant and bittern. In fact, some translations won't even reference birds. It might say hedgehogs. I've ran into this before. It's a Hebrew word that we just frankly don't know what it actually meant. It's oftentimes translated as cormorant or bittern. Hedgehog is another popular one. You get people translating in a certain time frame, and they use ostrich. And the ostrich will dwell in it. And it's just, in reality, it's, the best I can come up with to translate this word is to say it's wild birds and beasts. And that's why it's usually two named. It's a word that kind of means wild birds and beasts. As near as we can tell, it's really like an unused word in the languages that the meaning has somewhat been lost. We kind of have an idea of what it means, and that's why you get these broad translations. Oh, the cormorant and the bittern, the ostrich and the hedgehog, they're all going to dwell there. It's the beast of the wilderness are going to dwell in the ruins of it, is the point. That's just always fascinating. I see that, and I've ran into that word before in a few places and realized like we just don't have a good way of translating what is being said here. But he's pointing out the desolation is going to exist in the threshold. They shall uncover the cedar walk. This is the rejoicing city that dwelt carelessly and said in her heart, I am, and there's none beside me. And how has she become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down, and everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his hand. So we see these nations around Israel are not going to escape the day of the Lord either. Those at the 4 points of the compass are also facing judgment. Mixed in with that judgment is a little bit of hope for Israel because it references them coming back from their captivity. And we're going to see a lot more of that type of language in chapter 3, the hope. And as I said, Zephaniah kind of tends to follow the classic pattern of the prophets that sometimes are 50 chapters long. Zephaniah boils it all down into 3 chapters. You know, he started out with his introduction, proclaimed doom that's coming on God's people, proclaimed doom coming to those around. And next week we'll get into, there's going to be a little bit more doom coming, and then there's going to be a message of hope and repentance, which we kind of saw in the first 3 verses of chapter 2. A little bit of a preview as he paused and told people to stop and seek the Lord, that they might be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. We're going to see more language like that next week, but we don't have time to get into it, and I haven't finished studying it all the way yet. So that's what we have for next week. Any questions about chapters 1 or chapters 2 this week? All right, we'll stop and get ready for worship.
Yeah. Oh, I saw pictures from the wedding and Thanksgiving and.
Late last night, we made it.
So it's not.
This Monday. The Monday before now. I'm looking here. We're not finished.
Hi, pretty girl. Like your dress, how are you doing? Good job. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So we got a lot done in a short period of time.
And that's probably one of the things that they